In the last section, we discussed the consumer side of Solarpunk food chains. Now let's talk about the producer side of urban farming and gardening. These come in 2 layers, traditional farming and gardening, and permaculture, which includes gardens on small plots and food forestry on larger ones. There are many advantages to urban farming, though if everyone tries to do it individually, there is a lot of waste and failure, and without a community, gardening involves a bit of privilege. One of the advantages is that unlike in rural places where most of the agriculture is grown, urban places have a lot of people, many of whom are underemployed who can help for either food or money depending on how the communities are organized. The food doesn't have to travel very far at all, unlike in rural settings, and many homes currently have a lot of unused arable land thanks to minimum lot sizes that can be used for farming. We currently refer to these wasteful water-intensive gas-guzzling status flexes as lawns. A well-trimmed lawn was a status symbol for the rich for most of history. Being able to grow something worthless and have it trimmed by the hired help was a luxury and a show that you had more money than you knew what to do with and didn't care about the people you had to use to get it. With the creation of the suburbs, R1 zoning and minimum lot sizes, as discussed in the 3rd section of Solarpunk Urbanism, along with a post-war industrial boom, making the gas-powered lawnmower more available, victory gardens of the war gave way to a fresh green lawn as considered the ideal middle-class way to happiness, many enforced and in some areas from yard gardens being banned altogether. This compounded the monoculture issue that farming and forestry were creating, ensuring pollinators faced one of the worst periods of their existence. American lawns were sterile of life and variety and the need to rake and remove leaves that insects use for egg-laying and hibernating. It was a post-apocalyptic wasteland for pollinators. The amount of non-usable land growing nothing but grass that needs constant pointless maintenance and water is staggering. Then add the fact that unlike cars and trucks that have set emissions and noise standards, lawn care equipment has none of these standards, and the collective lawn care equipment has the most pollution and greenhouse gases as all the cars on the road. If you drive by someone destroying eardrums with a fossil fuel-powered leaf blower, it feels like someone has rolled coal on you. The only place that needs grass at all is areas for sports, and many parks can fit that. That said, golf is one of the most anti-solarpunk sports possible, as it uses so much land to produce literally nothing but enjoyment to the mostly rich. It is the suburbs of sports, and if it has to exist as a sport, it should be free to the public and run by the city. Private golf courses under eco-Georgism would be taxed into oblivion for the amount of city-subsidized waste it produces. Barring eliminating lawns entirely or heavily taxing them with a neo or eco-Georgist model we discuss in the 6th section of Urbanism, passing laws to fully electrify all lawn care equipment will be essential. If you have to have a lawn, try and get away with local grasses that use less water and grow slower. Many cities have exceptions for rain and bee gardens, but check with your local rules. However, in places where you're forced to have a minimum lot size but can do with it what you want, this is a great advantage for building a solarpunk community where urban gardening is your focus. If enough of you have lawns, all members can work together to ensure produce is cared for and ensure maximum yields. When Cuba was embargoed after the fall of the Soviet Union, they had to learn how to use every inch of their soil in the most efficient ways possible. Because of this, they have an intense method of urban gardening networked together where people freely share tips and share work to ensure everyone is fed. They learn the science of how to grow certain plants together. Every food grown on the island is organic, certainly not by government choice, and Havana supplies 90% of its own food, something impossible for another area of that size using modern monocultures, especially if it was all organic. Just imagine if we did this in the US, where we have better climate conditions from less hurricane damage and access to all the modern science and equipment we want. One of the first steps can be group soil testing to ensure there isn't lead pollution in the soil and find out what produce is the most conducive to that soil. After that, people can plan and organize events where the community will come over and prep the seedlings, the soil, and compost, and then plant them. Then they will have assigned duties to ensure each garden is maintained as needed. Those who know how to garden can teach classes to other folks. Most likely, if your community is centered around urban farming, it's because at least a few folks have some knowledge of gardening. Gardening is hard and complicated. There are so many things to know and so much advice out there to try. The internet is full of ideas. Lasagna gardening or raised beds? Lazy gardening or intensive gardening? This isn't a section on how to garden. The internet is full of these videos from people who are experts, unlike myself. However, there are a few non-standard options for gardening you can try if you have enough space. One is aquaponics. This is a process where fish like tilapia are grown in tanks and vegetables are grown floating on top of them. The roots aerate the water for the fish and the fish fertilize the plants with their waste in a cycle. Plants like duckweed, which doubles its mass in 24 hours, can be used to feed the fish, and if you live in certain areas of Australia, you can get black soldier flies grown from waste to feed to fish and chickens, turning something you can't eat into something you can. Aquaponics requires some upfront cost and space, so it might not be best for specific communities, especially to start off with. Same with greenhouse growing, which might be great in the long term, but not in the short term. One hype product at one point was the concept of vertical farming and farm scrapers. That in theory sounds good, but it's going to be a while for them to actually make a profit. It turns out the tech required for vertical farming is still experimental and expensive for the average person or group to use, and it turns out skyscrapers don't do well at all with the high humidity needed to farm in them, so they are also out. Lazy gardening is a method of throwing seeds into the ground and seeing what happens, doing the least work and getting something out of it. There are many videos on this topic. Indoor vegetable hydroponic growers are also on the market, and if your community can figure out how to sustainably grow with them, that's extra nutrition. However, it's unknown if these products will be able to pay for themselves over a long enough time. However, if you want to go in the opposite direction, permaculture is a concept by which one tries to work with and mimic nature to design the most efficient systems of gardening or planting to get the most yield out of the least amount of work that can last a long time, where all the plants, insects, and soil microbes work together as a team, working with nature instead of against it. Weeds can be treated as a plus, not a minus, either from placing a wet tarp over them for several months so they create soil fungi that produces the nutrients the soil is missing, placing mulch or cover crop to allow the weeds to be converted into organic matter, or even allow some edible weeds to grow and be part of the garden. Permaculture is a set of principles to allow dynamic variation to mimic the diversity and microclimates of forest. Capturing resources instead of buying involves methods of capturing rainwater where legal and creating your own fertilizer via composting. This feeds into producing no waste. There is no waste in permaculture. Everything is reused and processed for further use. Growing gardens with flowers that attract pest control insects, using fallen leaves and grass clippings as mulch, are all permaculture. Permaculture involves three major rules: earth care, people care, and fair share, as it's designed to be around the community, not just one person if possible. Permaculture is something every solarpunk garden should be aiming for if at all possible, even if you don't start out that way. Finally, if you want to go for the granddaddy of them all in terms of permaculture, if you have the land, you can grow a food forest. These are managed forests from around the world. The oldest known food forests are in Morocco and Vietnam. For the longest time, it was believed that the Amazon had incredibly low populations for most of its existence. After some research, it turns out the Amazon rainforests were created, not naturally grown, and the lushness is because the inhabitants were what we refer to as horticulturalists or food forest experts. The Amazon grew lush from controlled burns, mulching, and coconut shells, and had roughly 5 million people at its peak, something archaeologists never dreamed to be possible without agriculture. Horticulturalists worked even less than hunter-gatherers on acquiring food, and most often treated it like a commons that required everyone to give work so everyone could freely take, as nomads or sedentary, depending on how they felt like living. A food forest is built on 7 layers. Each member of a layer either produces food, provides protection, or provides nutrients. The canopy layer can be made up of large fruit or nut trees, same with the lower layer trees. Below that is the shrub layer, which are your bushes, be it berries or even bushes with edible leaves for salads. The lower layer is the herbaceous layer, where you plant herbs and vegetables, and then you have your rhizomes or root vegetables that work to feed and gain from the soil just as tree roots do. The next and lowest level is the ground cover that protects the ground from having water and nitrogen leaching out of it. Ground cherries and strawberries can fit these descriptions. And lastly, there are the vining plants, such as beans or even grapes, that climb up the trees to produce fruit as well. It is estimated that a good food forest can produce food for 20 people per acre. It's on average 15 people per acre with modern farming techniques. If a crop fails, it's not as big a deal, as there is still plenty of food growing. The variety can protect it from infestations and blight from spreading. This requires a specific lot size, so it might not be as viable as a permaculture garden, but payoff is amazing if you can figure it out. And you can even raise chickens in the understory and allow them to eat bugs and fertilize the land with their waste, so long as they have a coop to go into at night to evade winged predators. And if you're brave enough, you can take permaculture to a militant level and do what is called guerrilla gardening, where you go out and take unused or abandoned land and grow plants on that land. You can do what is called a permablitz, where you get a group of people and convert it into a permaculture or lazy garden, depending on how safe you feel working on someone else's abandoned land without their permission. Seed bombs are also a form of guerrilla gardening, and some even do gardening by night to reduce the chances of being told they can't do something, as it's easier to ask forgiveness than permission. There are classes and videos on all of these. This is probably the most complicated of all the Solarpunk focuses outside of possibly, or even comparable to the Solarpunk tech section. Getting yourself out there and growing as a group and community is essential to attaining Solarpunk and group self-sufficiency. Gardening is so much work as an individual, and you certainly cannot be self-sustaining on your own. Together in a network using permaculture principles, you can feed your neighborhood or even entire cities if you can get big enough. But it requires sustainable community at its core, or none of this is possible. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. If you wish to be a part of this project, or want your Solarpunk art displayed discussing any of our main points of focus, please send everything to solarpunkusa@proton.me. There is also a Patreon link for my main channel if you like what I'm doing. For the first section involving community building, this channel will be run directly by myself. After that point, I hope to make this a collaborative project with many people involved, including voice, information, and editing, to make this a robust channel that can spread and grow.